Hello and welcome back. We are now pushing into chapter 3 in our main textbook, and we're going to talk about the views. And views are once again one of those like basic structures of the MVC architecture, and a very important one. If I could summarize it in any simplistic sort of way, ultimately a view is what we're pushing back to the user's screen, regardless of how it's created. One of the key takeaways from this chapter is learning kind of a couple different ways that views can be generated, but to understand why in modern MVC, ASP.NET application development, we really strongly favor using the Razor View Engine to do the output because of some of the simplicities it allows us and more effective code. And I think that we did a little bit of just kind of brief overview a week or two ago about what Razor looks like and what it brings to the table in terms of structuring your code and not having to basically escape in and out of HTML stuff. Now, the whole kind of point of doing all of this really is whenever you're interacting with a user on a screen, if we think about traditional HTML development, it kind of is a pretty flat environment. There's not really interactivity on any significant level, even when you're interacting with form elements in HTML, which is one of the things that drives a lot of applications. When you're working with static HTML, basically you're just kind of jumping from page to page. And even the stuff that you put on the screen, even if you're using JavaScript, there's not really a lot of dynamic control of the content. The exception would be, of course, if you're running server-side JavaScript with Node.js or a similar tool, you might get some of that interactivity. But remember, what we're doing here is we're creating server-side web pages and applications. And the whole point of that sort of an approach is really to kind of mimic what we're used to seeing in the traditional operating system native application. So we're trying to get the same kind of thing to happen in a browser interface. The view is a component of the MVC that basically will receive the resulting output of whatever other programmatic logic, database interaction, mathematical processing, interaction with the user, whatever the combination of those things are. Ultimately, the user expects something back on the screen, and the view is that piece. And I think that's pretty understandable at this point. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to go into and look at some of the pages that are already happening within the file structure inside of Visual Studio. If you don't have Visual Studio up and running, please go ahead and launch that. I'm actually launching it right now. It's coming up on my second screen with a splash screen, but now it is bringing up this interface and I'm just going to go ahead, at least for right now, and just open up the music store thing that we've been working on so far, just for a basis of comparison. Now, I know they show the code in the book, but I also like to pull it up within the application itself so you can see where the stuff resides. And that's really kind of one of the things you learn when you do this is, this MVC architecture is different. You're using different folder layouts than you might normally be accustomed to. As you think about what you do in a regular HTML, website, really not an application necessarily, is you might have some subfolders, but what are the folders you typically make? Think about it. You maybe have a folder for your images. You might have a folder for your scripts if you have that many. You might have one for your CSS even if you have that much CSS. Some people even go as far as putting their pages into folders. But it's also not unusual in a basic website to just kind of throw everything in the root folder too, with maybe only your images going in a subfolder. MVC really doesn't like that, and once again we go to this convention over configuration thing. And you'll notice that views do have a special place in the structure. So we do have a views folder, and then underneath that we will have views that also match some of the controllers that we develop. So you'll notice that we have a home controller and we also have a home view folder, that we have a store controller, and we also have a store view folder that typically or currently empty. ended up doing a rebuild of this application, so you'll see that I don't have all the authentication stuff here, but that's irrelevant for what we're doing right now. So just to show you what is in a view folder, let's go ahead and expand one and check it out. So let's go actually to the index view, and I want you to notice right away that the file extension on this is index, yes, with a capital I, not a lowercase. Thank you, Microsoft. And the file extension is a 6-letter extension, kind of unusual, but CS-HTML, which stands for C# HTML. That has a special meaning to the ASP.NET Engine, so that when it goes to render this page for the screen, it realizes that there's back-end code that's helping to build it. And in this case, most notably, the Razor View Engine. And the Razor View Engine will always be designated by the fact that you're going to see that @ sign kind of highlighted there in your code, knowing that you're using Razor calls that are built into this architecture. You will notice that there is no doc type or head section or body declaration or any of that stuff, because that's handled elsewhere. So yes, we still have master pages and things of that sort that we build upon when we use ASP.NET 2. So that's just kind of to give you an awareness of what's going on. Let's go back over to the book and peruse the code there as well. But now you know where it is and where to go. And this shows you all the code that is on that page. All right? Now, when we trigger that method that launches that page, this action result call, which is in the home controller, so I'm going to bring that up on screen too, just to match up with the book, so you once again know where to find it. That home controller, which is a C# file, is responsible for triggering that view to happen. There is a built-in method called action result, whose job it is to call that view up from here. So it will, because this is the index, right, off the home controller, it's going to call up the index view. If we were to hit the About page, or at the top level of our application at the URL, type the word About into the URL, hypothetically, if we did that manually, it would then trigger the About view. Okay? You can see how simple that is. And conversely, when we do the contact, the same thing will happen. Right? Once again, triggering the contact view. So the one question students will have about this architecture is, do you always have to have a view for every method? We're going to think about it. Maybe, right? Maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe every time somebody makes a menu selection, it does generate a view for it. But maybe sometimes that view just does something programmatically that might actually take you to, let's say, a different view altogether that's disassociated from the method that you created it. So the best example I could give you right now is, let's say you had in the store controller a method called checkout. But checkout, before it could give you a view back, might have to process a payment and grab your credit card information and do all this other stuff. So it might not actually have a checkout view, but it might have a get the payment information view, whatever that might be called. So just to give you an idea of like the flexibility here. So very often we do have views that are directly tied to the methods, and sometimes we have some that are not. Okay? That's because we're doing programmatic things in the background that require different attention. All right. So that's part of the point of all this, is to show you how that all operates. Now, I love some of the syntax here that I think is kind of interesting, and that's why I'm putting this up on screen right now. So when you're going through and you create these messages, you notice that we were working with strings before. Remember that? So instead of like an action result, we were actually doing a string method. because that's what's being returned. In that case, we just created a string variable and fed in our whatever string we generated into that variable. But here, we're actually putting it into a structure called viewBag. Interesting terminology. I didn't come up with it, but that's what they call it in Razor. And that's kind of like the container into which we're pushing our content. Okay, whoever thought of that, interesting choice. But that's what it's called. It's called a viewBag. And then once we have it in the viewBag, then we can go ahead and return the view. And now this is where it kind of gets a little weird, because the view, remember, is the view related to the home controller in the folder called about. So there's an about view. Which view are we returning? The one that matches up with the method call in this case. That's how it works. So when we get back here, and we're going to be basically moving information from one structure to another, it's going to actually take this viewBag, right? And in this case, we're populating viewBag message, and it's going to end up where in this structure? Well, it's pretty easy to figure out. It's going to end up here, right? So if we're passing a viewBag message, so whatever the content of the page is, we can kind of dynamically control from a different location. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. Depends on what we're doing. And then we can push that to a view and then have that render. In more complicated application development, what will be happening is we might be running a query on a database to pull back a piece of information. We extract something out of the database, a very specific piece of information, and then feed back to that to a specific spot on the About page. And in fact, what we may end up doing, if it's a complicated application, you might be pulling back a whole bunch of stuff, right? So like if you were, let's say, pulling down, this is a music store site, maybe the album cover and the song listing and maybe even samples of the music or what have you, that would kind of make sense to go with that. You might be pulling all of that from a database, putting it into the method call, sending it off to the view receives it, processes it, and sends it back to the user. So that's kind of like the structure of it. The reason that's a useful thing to do, and this is the other question people have very often, is that allows me to create one generic structure for pushing the view back for similar things, so that I don't have to redo that for every single album. So let's say if I had a music store and I had 10,000 records I was selling, I wouldn't want to have to create 10,000 separate views. I create one that handles them all, and it does it programmatically. That's the efficiency here. You don't have to repeat the creation of all that code. All right? All right. Now the author kind of goes through this structure, kind of like I just did, and I kind of stole a little bit of his thunder. So if you wanted, you could play around a little bit and kind of hotwire things again. And that's really what they're trying to show you here. So if you had a view, and see, he's doing a little play here, right? So you don't necessarily have to push the view associated with method back to the view file that is associated with the file that you're already working with, or the method you're already working with. You can actually force it into a different view as long as the data types that you're sending are compatible. All right? So what he's indicating here, if you did want to do something like that, you just have to know the right syntax to call the particular view, but then you also have to be sending the right kind of data to it. Okay? So you got to kind of be careful there with that. But it is possible to, let's say, go from like your about controller or method and push it into the index view if that was really what you wanted to do. There's nothing stopping you, just a matter of the logic. I would call that a little unconventional and probably, possible to cause a lot of problems, but it's something that can happen. All right. They do go through this kind of thought here about how this technology can fall a little bit short. The whole idea here is this, right? They're trying to give you a way, if you had an extensive list of albums that you want to generate a view for, you wouldn't want to go ahead and manually create all those things. That's kind of the point here. So for example, let's say I want to just get a list of all the albums that are available. One possible thing that you could do is you could write a loop like this, right, where you would create, some sort of a list or an array structure. You would go ahead and you would parse in that information from your database or wherever, text file, wherever you have it listed. It would read it all in, and then you could push that all out to a view, right? However, what you can do that's more efficient is you can actually do something like this. You can put in a for each loop, and this would go directly into the view. Now this is where it gets interesting, because Razor is a view engine. That's what it's called, right? So I wouldn't have to programmatically do it in the method call. I could actually do it directly in the output. And that's a little bit of a disassociation from maybe what you're used to doing in regular program development. But at the same time, it's kind of powerfully cool, because not only that, it's a little bit simpler declaration. It's just a simple for each, and yes, it is a Razor call. So it's kind of like this weird hybrid between the Razor syntax and C#. So we're still using C# terminology here. And if you have not ever seen any of these, like IEnumerable, has anybody ever heard have you ever heard of that, Javier?
IEnumerable. I believe so. It's where the value has to stay the same or something like that?
Well, yeah, in terms of the structure, yes. So in other words, when we read in the list of albums, they'll go into a spot in a list or an array. And technically, it's an array list is really the structure whenever you see those brackets around album. And then as they drop into the structure, they will have the index value of the position enumerated, and that's why it's IEnumerable. So it's enumerated to that album, and then it kind of sticks with it. And that's correct. It kind of stays static with it. So that's the one way that you can do it. Another way that you could do it, and there's various approaches here. You can also set it up so that it's dynamic, so you don't necessarily have to know. You drop it in as a view bag directly. You can just set up this dynamic thing, and it kind of handles it for you. What's right or wrong, it really kind of is subjective. And they basically here what they're doing is they're demonstrating a few different approaches. Ultimately, what is best for something like this is the part of MVC that we haven't learned yet. And that is to actually create a data model for the information that pre-exists, so that we would actually have a file that would basically generate the database table information for us that we're interacting with directly. So while we can use the view engine to dynamically pull stuff from the database, that's not really its job. That's kind of the point here. So when we get to the model part of MVC, we will let the models handle the data interaction, and the view engine just puts the stuff up on the screen. And then that for each loop becomes even simpler, because we're just pulling it up directly from the model, which really, in essence, is like the result of a database query. That's what that is. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to note here. Whenever we switch to using models, you're going to see that we're also going to add in a declaration like this one, because in order to use a model within any of our pages or code pages, we have to put in a using statement, which is like an import statement in Java. So we're saying that we have this data model that exists as some sort of a file or whatever, and we're attaching it to this particular page, and then once it's attached, all we have to do is call it. That's kind of the point. Don't worry, this is not something that you need to memorize at this point. Not at all. It's a little bit of a preview of what's coming, and we do it very incrementally and gradually and gently, so don't freak out, okay? So don't go into panic mode, because I know that, when I first see, stuff that's brand new like this, it does a little bit of that to me, and and you know what? That's perfectly normal. But ultimately, the other thing that you'll have to do is when you start to do all these using statements with stuff that you're creating. I mean, normally when you build an application, you have like these these namespaces that are provided so that when you are doing using statements for like MVC, web routing, you don't have to include the system.web stuff in there too, so you have this file where you add it. And then conversely, you can also add your stuff that you made, right? So you can call, basically you're calling in your own stuff. And instead of calling in this case, a class file, we're actually calling in a namespace, which contains the class file within it. Just a method of encapsulation. All right, let's move on. All right, so some of the basic commands that you'll start running into here are things like this, and these are just kind of, intro level kind of things. Are the ability to, in the view bag, pull in current time, all right, in this case, one of them is like hard-coded and one of them is not, and then you can call the built-in functions that exist in the .NET infrastructure. Same stuff you learned if you took a VB class or if you took a C# class at all. And we don't really do a lot of like heavy hand coding in these ASP.NET classes because frankly, a lot of times web developers kind of tend to stay hands off that stuff. But it's good to know those things. And these are just primitive examples. All right. Other thing that we're going to do is get to the point where we're getting these models in a little bit deeper into the architecture here. So let's take a look at this silly little example. So I mentioned before in the previous video that we did in chapter 2 that we were sending parameters to our controller's methods through the URL. And sometimes, and frankly these days it should be super, super rare, that you have a user that goes right to the address bar and types something in to try to trigger something to happen in an application. More likely what will happen is we will have structures pre-built, and in this case, the structure is going to be a drop-down. And that drop-down will pre-contain a bunch of code and listings so that when a user chooses, metal or country or, dance music or whatever, it's got those calls to the methods and the parameter passes already built in, and then we just set it up to be dynamic so that it automatically pulls it in and generates even the drop-down box automatically as opposed to hard coding that. So think like how many genres of music are there? Well, oh my God, I mean, could be countless. It depends on how you're quantifying things, right? So you wouldn't want to necessarily have to recode your application every time, let's say a new form of music came out or a new classification came out. You could just basically have that in your database as an entry. You don't have to recode your code files. This will go to your model, which pulls from the database. It populates the drop-down list automatically and also generates the correct code to trigger it. And if you set up your structures properly, you have all these tremendous shortcuts like this that you can employ. Remember, the key is to not have to replicate a manual process. So if you thought, like, think of an application where maybe you were, I don't know, getting information from somebody and you were asking them what state they live in, right? And then all of a sudden the United States goes out and conquests a couple other countries, and now we have 10 more states to add. Well, I could just add those states to my database rather than go into my code files and find all the places where I listed all the states manually. It would just pull in automatically from the database. That's the mindset, okay? Simple as that. All right. When you end up doing some other things in C#, and I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not, but this is another one of those little tidbits that I always find interesting, is when you start to create certain classes and methods and objects inside of class files in C#. In Java, if we were to go ahead and create a constructor function for something, we would normally create the data types that sit at the top of the class file, and then we would have a default constructor, and then we probably have to have a getter and a setter to be able to send information to and adjust information for any of the things that we're creating. But with C#, all you have to do is actually declare what the structure is, whatever data type it is. So it could be a list, it could be a decimal or a number, it could be a string. That's the 3 examples that they have there. And then all you have to do inside of curly brackets is say get, semicolon, set, semicolon, and you got all your getters and setters. And you don't have to do anything particularly fancy with it. I know with Java, if you got your terminology a little bit wrong, or you didn't pass the stuff around, it was a little bit more manual. Although eventually most people figure out with their IDE, it's a right click and you can add getters and setters automatically. And you can kind of do that here too. But since it's so simple to call it with just a direct get and set, it really can kind of save a lot of time. Now, the thing that they demonstrate next in this chapter, and I'm very mindful of the clock, and I know that we're kind of getting really kind of to the bottom of where the content I want to cover in this chapter, is this thing here where they have the capability here, if you want to follow the rest of the examples in this chapter, and I encourage you to do so, you can actually add in the NuGet Package Manager console, you can type this at a command, and I'll show you how to do that, to install the MVC Music Store, and it'll give you a demonstration of this. This is not a requirement, folks, but if you do this, it'll teach you a couple different things about Visual Studio. So for most of you, whenever you're working on a project like this, there's a way that you can trigger NuGet. And for those of you that are not familiar with that tool, first I'm going to show you the graphical version of that. Whenever you're working on a project and you want to add third-party tools to your project. So for example, if I was doing a website and I wanted to add jQuery, right? I would go to the root of the project like this, I would come down here, and I could either add whatever thing it is I need manually, but in this case I know that it's a NuGet package, and I would just simply click this tool. It'll bring up a separate interface, and if I wanted to throw in jQuery, well, that just happens to come up right at the top, or I could come up here and search for it and drop it in. Now there's also a NuGet console, and I'm trying to remember where that's accessible. It's right there. Okay, so that was pretty good. Sometimes, I use this tool so rarely now, but I want to give you guys a little historical perspective. When I first started using Visual Studio, if you wanted to add like a third-party package, the only way to do it was this way, manually. You would come into that menu, and then you have a console at the bottom. So if I wanted to install something, right, and see how it has its own prompt and everything? Yeah. You would type install whatever, 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 and it would pull it in. So if you wanted to see this, you can actually just copy that text and bring it over here to the console, paste it in, press enter, and it's going to drop in the whole thing for you. Now hopefully it works. I'm assuming it looks like it's working. And then it just imported all the models into the project. All right. So that's not a small thing. Now class is technically done here, but here's where I'm leaving this chapter with you. Go through this process. You can add it to your MVC Music Store and follow through some of the examples. There's not really a lot to code and build. It's really more of like just showing you where stuff is at and giving you a little bit of a preview of what's to come down the line. As far as the work that's required for this chapter, and I'm going to go back to our course shell here for a real quick moment. That would take us into Unit 3. There's not really coding per se here, but there is this reflection and resources assignment, which is basically typing up a document. And then there's the extra credit piece, which is working with that thing that we just loaded up. So feel free to explore that. It's extra credit. My advice is, I think it's easy enough. Go ahead and do it. Take the points. Maybe save you some hassle later on in the course. Meanwhile, by the time I get this video posted, I assume I'll have Unit 4 published as well. And what Unit 4 is going to do for us, it's going to move us into this new tutorial document that I attached to the course. And in the subsequent weeks, what's going to happen is we are going to be plowing through that entire document cover to cover. It's like 100 some pages of tutorials. But they're excellent tutorials. They're really clean and simple. They don't do a lot of fluff in there, and they teach you all the things that we've already learned. So we'll review controllers and stuff, and then we're going to ramp up all that knowledge. And in some cases, we'll be building from exercise to exercise, and in some cases not. But that's a little bit of a preview. And that's it for tonight, folks.